My name is Jed Morfit. I am the professor of sculpture here at Stockton. And so this is a brown bag on monuments, with my expertise being that I am at least tangentially related to monuments and that I make sculptures. This conversation happens in the context of a larger conversation that is happening at Stockton about the Stockton Memorial and the relationship to Stockton. And so we are going to have a panel next week on the 17th, same time, same time block, just a week from now, that will have 3 sculptors on it who are in the process or have monuments as part of their practice. And so we have Steve Lane, who has made a beautiful sculpture of Joe Frazier in Philadelphia. And then we have 2 artists who have made work for part of the Monument Lab in Philadelphia, sort of exploring other ways in which monuments can be created and other ways in which, or examine how monuments, who are monuments represented. Okay, so with that conversation though, it seemed important to do a little bit, this is a little groundwork. This is like the prereq for that, in that you might want some of this information, particularly if you haven't come across contemporary sculpture before. What they're talking about will be really surprising if you haven't seen this, or if you haven't given any thought, particular thought, to how monuments operate as a signifier of power, then that would also be a surprise to you. So that's what we're hoping to do with this lecture. So, as with that, any good academician, we want to start with defining terms. In this case, let's start with the language is a good place to start. When we talk about, just a quick, I did a Google search for what's happening in the news as being described as monumental and a monumental failure. Okay? And it's all over the map, right? It is a whole range of things. This is just from the last 2 weeks of things that have been described as monumental or monumental failures. Nigerian military exercises, Blue Devils against South Carolina. Although on the other side, is this a laser as well? On the other side, you can see that it was monumental for the other team, right? So it goes either way. So when we are talking about monumental or monumental failure, what are we talking about? And the basic definition is going to be important, extensive, large, right? That's monumental when we describe it as an adjective. I would argue, is this the laser pointer? Yes. This is my secondary definition. As we look back on the previous usages, when we say something is monumental, you can come on in.
Hey, Dan.
When we describe something as monumental, we don't just mean something large, we mean something of particular significance, right? The Queen Elizabeth II is monumental in scale, but the Titanic sinking is monumental in that it was particularly significant. Okay? And this is important, and it becomes important when we start to talk about monuments, because a monument is a sculpture that is given particular importance. Right? It is set apart from society and considered specifically as being significant or definitive about a period, a legacy, a person, what have you. So when we talk about art terms, these are the basic definitions: statue, building, or structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. We're going to come back to this one a bunch, okay? A statue or other structure placed by or over a grave in memory of the dead. Memorial. Memorial and monument, we're going to talk about the relationship between those two things a little bit. And then historical importance, outstanding, enduring, memorable example. We'll look at that as well. Just to clarify, many works of art are described as being monumental. Right? Guernica is a monumental work. F111 is a monumental work. It is large. It is significant. But monuments are sculptures or buildings. Okay? So that physical 3D aspect is I don't know of anything that is described as a monument that does not occupy 3-dimensional space. All monuments are sculpture, but not all sculptures are monuments. We'll talk about that. It's like a little logic question, but that's down the road. The relationship has, it used to be much closer, and now it has separated much further. And not all monuments are memorials, but memorials can be considered monuments. Lincoln Memorial, Washington Monument. You can try and parse that for a while. Why is one and one the other? It is unclear. The literature does not give a satisfactory answer to why it's not the Washington Memorial or the Lincoln Monument, for that matter. So sometimes they are used interchangeably, but you can have a monument to someone who is not dead. You can have a monument to an event, obviously, so memorials are not always monuments. Again, if we look through, we can just sort of pull out some of these significant phrases here. Commemorate a famous or notable person or event, historical importance or interest, outstanding, enduring, memorial, a memorable example of something. In these definitions, we can start to see why there are debates about monuments. Right? We are by definition saying this object is important, this person is important, this should be considered as special and separate. The structure of monuments does that as well, but the way we think about monuments, as soon as you erect a monument, you are saying this is important, and I would argue, to go back to our earlier conversation, we are saying this is in some way definitive, right? This defines a group of people, this defines a moment, this becomes the stand-in for a larger picture, and defines it. And when you start to say something defines it, then you start to get friction, right? Because now we have multiple definitions. All right, so monuments and social relationships. For the vast history of Western art, vast majority of Western art history, sculpture and monuments shared essentially the same characteristics. In some ways, monuments were the public face of sculpture that would just be doing the same thing privately, in some ways, right? If we think about famous or notable persons with performing the act of a declaration of cultural hierarchy, and then often combined with description, assertion of significant cultural narratives and values, we can see that in monuments, and we can see that in private sculpture at the time, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The declaration can be deliberate and aggressive, or implied and relatively passive. There's a nice phrase from material culture studies that says, objects are social relationships made durable. Monuments are a very explicit example of that notion, right? Everything, and when I talk about this in my material culture classes, everything signifies, right? Every object signifies. What toaster you buy, what car you buy, what clothes you are wearing, you cannot not play in the world of material culture, right? You get dressed in the morning, no matter what, you are making a statement. If you decide to go naked, you are making a statement. If you want to wear a leotard, that would be another statement. If I wear a uniform every day, I am making a statement, no matter what, right? I cannot not participate in the culture of things, and I cannot have them not signify. A memorial is, or a monument, is something where we are collectively signifying, and it becomes much more significant through that collective signification. So let's look at a couple examples. So here's very traditional ones that we may be sort of familiar with. Private sphere, public sphere. So this is going to be a monument, and this is going to be sculpture. Okay, but in effect, they are doing very similar things, right? We've got Augustus of Prima Porta. He is being used as propaganda throughout the Roman Empire. We are sending this, we have made this sculpture, and there will be copies of this sculpture propagated throughout the empire. And what is happening in here is, there's a whole bunch of, I should really get Amy Papalexandru in here to describe to you all of the various things that are happening in here to signify why this is how this is working as propaganda. But we see the hand up, right? He's actually pointing at his troops. We've got all kinds of things happening inside here that are telling us a story, a narrative about the Roman Empire at that time. He's been idealized enormously. He was 70 years old, theoretically, when this sculpture was made. He looks 30 and amazing. Okay, so this is the Photoshop of its day. We are cleaning up everything and presenting an ideal version of our leader here. We put this in not necessarily our square, but also your square, right? When we come into your neighborhood, we'll put one up and say, here is the new leader. Here is the boss, okay? And look at how noble and sort of powerful he is. Look at how he references other things you've seen. He's got bare feet, which is may or may not totally sure, be significant as to whether or not he was in fact a god. He's referencing all kinds of things. And he's in marble. And he's exquisitely crafted, so he is convincing on a number of levels. This is ancient propaganda. We go forward, 700 years. It's essentially doing the same thing in the private sphere. Okay, we've idealized Félicité. We are putting her on a pedestal, right? In the same way, we are enlisting craftsmen of tremendous skill using an extremely expensive material. All of these things would be unavailable to 99% of the population. It's like having your own helicopter, right? If you had your bust made in the 1700s, you were essentially declaring your wealth in the same way that now you might carry a $3,000 handbag or I don't know what else, right? So in this way, both of these are operating along similar lines as a declaration of power and social hierarchy. Okay? One of them is for public consumption, one of them is going to be for more private consumption for just a smaller set of the population. But they are working very similarly. That's going to be important for us down the road. Also, if you would please, note this hand. Note the whole pose, because it's going to be amazing. We're going to go down and look at some other examples. This is relevant for 1,000 years. It's relevant for 2,000 years. Kind of surprising how that goes. Okay, I want to also just remind people as we look down the line is that there are ones that we forget were monuments and controversial. The David is now the David, right? It is outside of conception of anything in terms of controversy. But at the time, this was a statement, or was taken as a statement, of Florence's sort of resolute independence from the Medicis. And so where he was placed, David looked toward Rome with his sling. Okay, so we are sending a very strong message of, we're little, but we'll take you on, right? This is the moment before the battle, so this has got kind of an incipient power to it. He was intended to be elevated, which is why his hand is so small, so large. So you'd be looking up at him. But this was absolutely a cultural statement of independence, and there's a kind of a pugnacity to this, right? We will stand independent. And this was, when it was erected, pelted with stones, and actually his arm was broken in 3 places. I did not know that until I was researching this. So this was a controversial sculpture in its day. It has since been whitewashed of all of that and clarified? It's been cleaned up from that. But at the moment, this was a contentious moment. This is sort of what we are talking about now. This is the conversation that is sort of perhaps most relevant to the Stockton issue, where this is Robert E. Lee in Richmond, right? Yeah. This is in Richmond. And here he is up on his horse, and we can see, obviously, this becomes an issue, and I'm not going to rehearse the whole thing because we'll talk more about it. But having a Confederate figure astride a horse looking as noble as this on top of this pedestal, overlooking the entire city, much of which is populated by African Americans. In any case, it's part of the Union now and not part of the Confederacy. This becomes a contentious issue, although interestingly, was not a contentious issue for many years, decades. Was erected and nobody had a problem. But it's not actually true. Not nobody had a problem with it. People had a problem with it right from the beginning. Nobody listened, right? But now the voices have been building. But let's not also forget that this is about who won, right? So this is Sherman in Central Park. There's no monuments to Sherman in the South, okay? Sherman is the inventor of the phrase total war. Sherman burned 60 miles of Georgia in a swath. He was, a war criminal by any definition except the winning side's definition. So here's Sherman gilded recently, again, in Central Park, with winged victory going this way. He's actually, I always find this really amazing. Down here, this is a pine cone. This is the symbol of Georgia. So he is trotting Georgia underfoot as he moves along. You do not hear a lot of debate about the Sherman Memorial. No one is saying, let's take down Sherman. But he certainly could be a place where we would locate that conversation. So it's just about where the cultural moment is at any given time, right? Just from a sculptor's perspective, as someone who makes figurative sculpture, I just want to point out, this is the face of Sherman on top of there. So, which I just think is fascinating. So here he is, when you look back, the nobility of the whole thing, right? He's sitting erect on his steed, he's got his wind-blown cape and the whole thing. But Saint-Gaudens, the artist, was completely aware of his subject, and his subject was aware. His subject was ruined after the Civil War. He was devastated by the war. And so in the face, you see this sort of ravaged countenance. You don't see it from the ground. You can't see it when you look at the sculpture, but when you get up close, that looks like a lot of hard miles on Sherman. I always like the juxtaposition of the two. Material makes a huge difference too. You know, in gold, that's going to look a lot different than it does in terracotta. So, other places where we see, you know, contemporary issues moving along. This is Joe Paterno. Let's remember Augustus, right? Same pose as Augustus, leading the troops, but now it's football as opposed to the Roman army. And this is how things turn on a dime in a really interesting way, right? Paterno, tremendous hero for Penn State. The scandal breaks, and 3 months later he dies. So much conflict in the way people want to think about Paterno. People are coming after he dies and placing flowers at his grave, right? There is a tremendous sort of rallying around this figure, and then very shortly after that, the college takes it down, the university takes it down. Under cover of, they put up chain link, they hide it, and then they just disappear. And people are outraged on the one side and outraged on the other, right? Everybody outraged that it took them this long to do it, and that this was happening, and outraged then that it's taken down on the other side from all of these folks. So,
what was the controversy?
A huge sex scandal for, yeah, what's that?
I was trying to think of the name, Jerry
Sandusky. And the implication was that Paterno knew that this was going on the whole time. Right, and Paterno was not necessarily alone. But again, so what happens is, just to go back to our earlier slides, these become, because they are monuments, you know, Paterno was not the only person involved in this scandal, right? He was, in fact, he's not the perpetrator of it. He was apparently just someone who paid no attention, let it go by. Maybe facilitated, who knows. But this is where the controversy gets located, because we have set it up as definitive, right? He is now speaking not just for Joe Paterno, the individual, but for the entire program, and in some ways the university, around this issue. Closer to home, this was yesterday or 2 days ago, but I got lucky, got to put it in here. This is Frank Rizzo. Frank Rizzo, his monument in Philadelphia went unremarked upon for many years, until this moment has started to rise, where people are starting to reinvestigate these monuments and say, why this person versus that person? Why do we have a monument to Robert E. Lee? And the Lee sculpture is that one remains. The one we looked at earlier remains. The one in New Orleans has been taken down. We look at Rizzo, and Rizzo was, you know, as I started to read more into the story, I'm not from Philadelphia. I had no idea the character of this man, but not, you know, laudatory in many ways. Some people think he's a great guy, did a lot for the city. Other people think he's a racist, right? So, and there seems to be ample evidence that that was the case, so that's an interesting context. And then the question that will come up as we go further on is, so what? What do you do with this information? Rizzo was not a nice guy, but he was also the mayor of the city, and did things that some people are going to say went forward. Do we take all of the monuments down for all of the racists? We're going to have not that many monuments left, starting. Well, you can start now, right? There's a lot. So we can take down all of the monuments, or what are we going to decide about that? I like this as a solution. This is Hank Willis Thomas, and here in the same plaza is a hair pick that has, it's sort of the famous Black Power hair pick with the hand raised. And now we get an interesting dialogue. We can just remove Rizzo and make it go away, or we can add other layers to the conversation. And I think that's that may be a more interesting solution, and that's something to talk about down the road. But this is a lovely place to just see the dialogue happening between monuments, right? Each one of these becomes a statement, and now we are actually having a conversation in a public sphere using monuments as proxy voices in some way, okay? So this is a nice lead-in also, because maybe, again, if you haven't been following contemporary sculpture as closely as I have, this is mostly what people think about when they think about sculpture. They think figurative, bust, they think Michelangelo, they think the thinker, right? That's sort of the conception that people have of sculpture in their heads. And so one of the things, the next phase will be to just talk about sculpture in general before we talk about how it impacts monuments. So with the rise of the modern era, conceptions of art expanded entirely, enormously. There's nothing that cannot be considered art, and inside that, sculpture is probably the broadest medium, right? If it hangs on a wall and it's got paint on it, it's a painting. If it's drawn on paper, it's probably a drawing, but everything else is probably a sculpture, right? Unless it's a performance. Sculpture is really very broad now. We'll talk about it in a second. I tell my students, you know that old thing about two paths diverged in the woods, right? But that's not what sculpture is like. Sculpture is like man versus wild. You see the show with man versus wild. You just take an individual and drop him in the middle of nowhere, and he can go any direction. That's really what sculpture is. There is no wrong answer at this moment for medium, process, any of these things. And because it exploded, one of the things that it did in that explosion is abandoning its relationship to the monument, but really all the sculpture that had come before. If we're trying to reinvent the medium entirely, we have to step away from what it was. Like, let's make something new, so let's not make a lot of Roman bust looking things. We're going to make something new. So this is what I show my class at the beginning of the semester. Just a quick primer, and we'll run through it. Sculpture can be any medium at this point. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what this is? It's very cool, isn't it? Yeah, beautiful. It's styrofoam cups. It's styrofoam cups all glued together and hung from the ceiling. This is Tara Donovan, who will do something like this. You can see them up here. Here are the cups, right? So she'll investigate one medium, one material over and over and over again. This is Brian Jungen. This is a full-sized whale skeleton made out of plastic lawn chairs. You can see all of the lawn chairs kind of stacked in here. So these are all bits and pieces of plastic lawn chairs, which has a nice resonance, things that we end up washed up in the ocean, they become garbage, and at the same time then transformed back into this whale skeleton. And this one, this is Robert Wilson. This one's a little harder to see. Imagine you walk out into this canyon here. It's about waist high. You can get a sense of the room. This is all motor oil. So he's taken the entire room. See the door is reflected here? And so he has filled the room with motor oil. Oh. He hasn't actually filled the room with motor oil, but when you walk in the space, it is though, you can see how it's doubled here?
Yeah.
So the whole space is a placid surface of 10W40, or whatever it is, motor oil. You can imagine the smell right? You can imagine, if you're me, the desire to run your fingers through it just to check, right? There's like a tremendous, so, you know, this is just the range of what's possible as a material in sculpture. Sculpture can involve any process. So we don't just make forms by modeling, carving, assembling. We can also roll a 55-gallon drum through a tube, through a field of dowels with Roman signer. And then when it stops, that's the piece. Like, it gets as far as it gets, and then we are left with the result. He's done a lot of great pieces in that way. We got Roxy Payne and Robert Smithson in two very different sort of glop configurations. Pouring adhesive down a hillside. That's a 55-gallon drum of adhesive. And this is this is plastic, thermoplastic, that's melted slowly to create these kind of great candle forms. This is an amazing series. I love this series for lots of reasons. They're beautiful, the shapes when you see them. Also, he's made sculpture that he never touches, right? So he produces unique objects. They just go down a conveyor belt. He produces one-of-a-kind objects that he never touches, so he then questions the whole hand of the artist, right? I've made a beautiful, strange form. No one else has ever seen it. No one could reproduce it, and yet I never touched it. So that's an interesting, he made this incredibly complex setup, but he results in that. Sculpture can be any scale. These are all from Antony Gormley. You can see from the light switch down here, not the light switch, the socket, that's 30,000 little clay figures filling a room. That's life size. These are all Gormley. And then that's the same idea at massive scale. So we're not constrained by any sense of scale, and it can go anywhere. Right? So here's underwater sculpture. Here's Salcedo in Istanbul, filling the space with chairs. This is, you know, it's about immigrants, wherever they're from. I don't know. And this is an amazing one. I love this because this is material and object. This is Roxy Payne. I get a lot of students who want to make trees in art class. You know, I'd like to make a tree. I'm like, what trees? Actually pretty complicated. Don't do me the broccoli tree. I want a tree. So here's Roxy Payne again, the same guy who made those plastic pieces. This is a stainless steel tree placed in the woods. And so it looks exactly like every other tree around it in terms of its form. It is painstakingly reproduced, except it is shiny silver and will be in all seasons, all the time, forever. Kind of a fascinating thing. So that is a very quick tour of the idea that sculpture can take any form. And so then we have to sort of say, all right, now we have an environment in which sculpture can be anything. What happens when we consider monuments in this era, right? How do we think about a monument now? And on the talk next week, I think we were really fortunate in that we have two people who are making contemporary monuments and one person who is making something more traditional, something that sort of would be recognizably look like Roman sculpture back in the day, and sort of talk about how that dialogue is happening for everybody. So the expanded role of sculpture did not mean the end of the monument. Rather, the definition of the monument expands to include new concepts and creative strategies. So, just for ease, I'm going to just stick with the pedestal for a minute. Just talk about the pedestal, because I have a nice series of examples that work on that. And my talk was off the pedestal, right? So we've got to talk about pedestals for a moment. So, first, Piero Manzoni, the magic base, where it automatically turns you into living sculpture. Right? All you have to do is stand up on it, and now you are a monument on your own. Turns everybody into a sculpture very easily. Important to recognize here that it's, you know, just cut plywood. It's not anything fancy. We're not trying to make you very special. We're just trying to make you a little special. And then Manzoni, it doesn't take him any time to figure out, like, all right, well, that's fine. That's a fine idea. You know what, we'll just do the whole thing. And so this is the base of the world, where he just inverts a pedestal and makes the whole world a monument. Okay, so now we're done. No need to have any further monuments, because I wrapped it all up. I've encompassed everything in my creative process, and we're done here. So there's just two quick looks at the base. this is where I'm going to get a bunch of these. This is the 4th plinth, and it's a public art project in Britain. It is a pedestal that was meant to have a sculpture that never got one, and so they open it up to contemporary artists to say, what would you put on it on a temporary basis, all right? And so here's Rachel Whiteread, who is known for casting the interiors of spaces, just taking the base and flipping it, right? So I just want to I want to draw your attention back to the base, right? And I'm going to do that not by recreating. She could have just done. She's known for mostly working in plaster, but this is resin because you sort of plaster wouldn't do much up here, right? We need something that's sort of more translucent. But it does do a nice thing where now you look at this shape, and then you recognize, oh right, I'm looking at the same thing going the other way. And sort of causes you to question the entire structure. And we'll see that that's what contemporary artists are most concerned with. Here's Alison Lapper, Pregnant, by Mark Quinn on the same pedestal. Alison Lapper is a woman with congenital birth defects. And so this, to me, it's like Mark Quinn did some research and found the person, you know, if you did a Venn diagram of everything that was going to be on a monument traditionally, and then looked at the place that excluded everything, he found it, right? So he's like a pregnant woman with disabilities. The only thing is that she's, you know, she appears to be Anglo-Saxon, right? So that would be the only other thing. He sort of found a trifecta of things you would not normally see on a monument, and he put them on a monument. In marble, lovingly crafted in the same way, using all the same language, except he's going to invert it by just changing our understanding of who goes up there. So that's Mark Quinn. This one's my personal favorite. This one did not actually ever get made in the space, but this is Public Figures by Do Hosu, where all the figures are down here. It's my personal favorite in terms of like who actually carries the weight of these people up on the pedestal, right? We saw Sherman up there all in gold. Sherman was not the guy. Sherman led the guys, right? And so this is the one that kind of flips it for me in the most interesting way. Interesting, I always talk to my sculpture students about this. It's very important to look at the poses of these figures under here, and I don't have a close-up for this slide. They are lifting in a forthright manner. They are supporting this, not weighed down. You know, it's not this. It's this. It's we elevate, right? They look engaged. It looks almost more like they almost look to me a little bit more like Chinese propaganda, right? The little figures. They've all got kind of simplified outfits. They are lifting. Which makes it interesting in that they are complicit in this. They're not buried under it, but they are supporting this and active in their role. And then, as we talk about in my classes, that this is empty is really interesting. So we're all lifting, and there's nobody at the top, right? What are we doing here? And this is one of the women who is coming, Karen Oliver. The battle is joined. This is a different pedestal. This is a pedestal taken from a Revolutionary War monument in Pennsylvania and placed in Philadelphia, but mirrored, right? So now the community is reflected. It's a version in some ways of this, except you see yourself in it. You are participatory just by being nearby, right? You are, and you become, in some sense, elevated as a result. So again, she's sort of employing strategies from Piero Manzoni and Do Hosu to create a contemporary version. Famous examples of this, perhaps this is the most famous, is the Maya Lin Vietnam Memorial, right? Which, if you think about it, it was so controversial. If you get a chance to see the movie, it's fantastic. The making of this monument. Maya Lin was awarded this when she was a grad student, right? I mean, everyone except for you poor children here who have to hear this probably remember this monument coming online and how controversial it was. But if we think about it, it really is an extraordinary step away from everything we've talked about prior to this, right? It digs into the ground. It's not one individual, but all the individuals. It has no kind of celebration of craft, no celebration of material. It's very sort of flat. I mean, it's beautiful, but it is almost, again, a reverse monument from everything that people had come to expect leading up to that moment. and so that people felt disrespected by this is not surprising, if only because it was so against their expectations, right? It worked so hard to, and I don't think she was working hard to defeat expectations, but that is in fact what it ends up doing. This is one of my favorites, the George Moscone Memorial. This is Robert Arneson, a personal hero of mine, was commissioned to make this. This is a weird choice. Arneson is known as a trickster sculptor in California at the time. He's doing portraits of himself smoking pot, like he's a bad boy, and he likes being a bad boy. And so that he would get this commission was a little surprising, particularly after Moscone was shot in City Hall. They wanted to memorialize him. They chose Arneson for the commission. Arneson did this portrait. He only showed them this part, which again, it looks like a used car salesman, right? It's not maybe the most flattering portrait, although I think it's probably a pretty good representation of what Moscone was like, kind of toothy, how you doing? But down here, he included bullet holes, the room number, all this stuff that's in here, Twinkies is down here, and bullet holes and Harvey Milk too. So he incorporated the assassination into the monument, and people went berserk. That's not how they wanted to remember Moscone. They wanted him on a pedestal. They did not want to talk about the ignominious manner of his death, and so this was pulled immediately. Went up for a day or something. It's not a long-term sculpture. And again, sort of using the language of the monument that we've seen, using the bust, all of that stuff, and then undercutting it here. Also in ceramic, for what it's worth. So that's a totally other material for this, but they knew they were getting into that. And this is one, this is a recent one. This is by a guy, he just had a show up at the Kramer Gallery. Jim DeCicino, local guy, went to UArts, went to Delaware, I think, made a 9-foot Edward Snowden memorial that he drags around and places. Which is kind of a great comment on Snowden, who is on the move, who was kind of fugitive in general, right? So we have a monument that is a secret monument that is illegally placed from place to place and then removed. And that's a really compelling monument to Snowden in a way that it's hard to replicate, right? That is Snowden in some ways. It'd be hard, if you just put a monument to Snowden, it doesn't make nearly as much sense as this, and dropping it and running, right? And then seeing what happens and doing the next one. Okay, and so that's sort of how we're thinking about this. And those are the figurative ones. The last two get more figurative, but there's a range of things that are happening in the sculptural world for that. So that's like a world tour primer. I thought I would show briefly one of the things we've been doing. Can I get the lights back on? Can someone do that? I'm sorry. So, here's the infamous Stockton Bust, right? It's not a good bust, necessarily, okay? Down in the basement now.
Special collections.
It's in the special collections. It's in the special collections, okay? This is a scan of it that we took this semester and reprinted it in the 3D model. This is the source of this whole conversation and our problem going forward, is that the school is associated with Richard Stockton, who is not a good guy. And how do we respond to this issue? And we are sort of having this dialogue as part of that response. I'm teaching a Sculpture 2 class about, that is sort of nominally about representation. So, so we looked at this question, and we came up with, there's Stockton, and then we scanned the entire class in the same way, and we put them on Stockton's face, on Stockton's body. And so, and I've got more. So I've got 15 or 16 of these coming from my students. So, the thinking is that in our instance, this guy is not the thing, right? Our relationship, Stockton's relationship to Stockton is tangential at best. There was the excellence lecture on this in which it really turns out it was laziness and white privilege that ended up with Stockton as our name. It was supposed to be 6 other things, and then they were like, no, we're just going to go with Stockton. No research, no discussion, just, he's the signer of the Declaration, how bad can he be, white guy, we're going to go with it, right? So, that's my takeaway. So, personal takeaway, right? But so, we don't want to be focused on Stockton the individual. That's not what makes this institution. And so we decided to take this as a result and say, let's bury him in here and let him be one individual of many, right? And the more people we add to this, the truer the representation will be of the university. So we can sort of expand this and display it in some way that sort of does justice to both things. The I Am Spartacus version of this, maybe except that Spartacus is a noble figure and Stockton is perhaps not, but I think this does do a nice leveling of the playing field where we can start to say, where we take the emphasis away from one thing and put it on the community as a result. So this would be another example of contemporary memorials. Small, temporary. Those are some issues that we'll have to think about down the road. This is certainly not a definitive statement. It's more of a response. One of the things that we'll talk about when we get the group convened on next week is what are the implications for your built environment if monuments become really suspect, right? We can no longer settle on one individual. We can no longer settle on a definitive statement, which I think is a reasonable place to be as a culture. But if you think back to like every place you've been that is beautiful and lovely, it is built with a patina of monuments and public works that were probably wildly inappropriate at some level. The pyramids. You could look at it and be like, look at the resources we're spending on the pyramids. This is insane. And but be ashamed not to have the pyramids. So it's an interesting conversation to have. The church, there's many examples of this. So this is an interesting solution in that it is little and temporary and an interesting response. And then it will go away and he will still be here because he's bronze. And so it's interesting to think about how those things intersect down the road.
Plastic lasts pretty long.
Plastic is not plastic is not nothing.
So where are we going to put this? And can we sign up to have our...
Well, yes. So this is the thing. Now we're just way off the topic, but yes, there is absolutely no reason not. This is just my students, so this is a cross section of Stockton students. This is my favorite because it's got handles.
Yeah.
But there is no reason we couldn't continually expand this project, and get to a place where we're Anthony Gormley wide. A room full of Stockton. We could absolutely do a room full of Stockton. All we would need to do is a lot of work. That's all that would be, which is fine. It's not, and this is all printed on the NAMS printers, and they've been very generous with making that happen for us. And I like that they just come in 3 random colors. I'm just going to leave it at that.
It's not 3 colors by...
It's no, I mean, maybe NAMS chose them. It's just what they had, so that's what we've got.
A nice overlay of interpretation.
A nice overlay of, right, exactly, absolutely. And so I'm just sort of sending them to them and saying, make them a range of colors, and we'll see. So that is the conversation about monuments and contemporary sculpture in a nutshell. Next week we will have Karen Olivier, Caitlin Pomerantz, who is another very young, she's a baby coming. She got her MFA in 2016. I can't even, I'm like, what? And then Steve Lane, who is my exact doppelganger. So it will be weird. We look exactly alike. But all of those people have a really interesting and different perspective on monuments and how that intersects and have boots on the ground experience in all 3 of those areas. So I hope you'll come by and check it out now that you've sort of got a better sense of the lay of the land. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.